right, we're in Job 5, verse 8. Job 5, verse 8. So this is still the first round of speeches, obviously. Eliphaz is the one who speaks first. And as you can see on the screen, we've been through the first part where he basically says you helped other people, but you can't handle it when it actually hits you. You can't take your own advice and unfair assessment. And then he's made his argument that Job is guilty. That's why this has happened. That's what he'll continue to say throughout the book. It's basically going to be a broken record. And then where we pick up now is him saying, here's what you should do. And when giving, especially as we're dealing with here someone who is suffering and dealing with grief, let's just not say those words. Here's what you should do. Okay? Part of helping people is helping them to realize. So, let me just back up. I am a strong proponent of a type of counseling, especially as the type of counseling that we see in the church a lot, of solution-focused counseling, which is you don't focus on the problem as much as you focus on the solution. If you focus on the problem, it keeps you stuck. All you think about is the problem, okay? So you're trying to envision and build a future where the problem is not dominant. And so basically, what you're doing when you do that is, as you're helping people, you're not considered the expert telling them what to do. You're asking them questions so they can draw out the answers that are already there, and so that they learn to take ownership and they can realize the answers on their own. And so a lot of times the way counseling is done is the individual that sits in the chair is the individual who is considered the expert, and they tell you what to do. What it ends up creating is you become dependent upon your counselor to tell you what to do. In solution-focused, you're trying to help the individual realize they know the answers to their problems, just ask themselves the right questions. And so one model promotes that you get people to depend on you, you're the expert, you tell them what to do. This model says, no, actually this person knows more about their life than I do. Let's help draw it out, not make them dependent on me. Let them learn how to answer the problems themselves. So, since that is the model I tend to follow, I really, when someone is struggling with something, saying, here's what you should do, that's just like near the top of the list of things you don't say. And it's really easy for us to say when we're on the outside of something and having never experienced, it's really easy for us to say what people should be doing. It's another thing to actually be in the midst of it and to be working through it. And even though there are some similarities between, even if I have experienced it and there are some similarities between their situation and my situation, every situation is also peculiar. And so we have to be really, really careful. And I think and the reason why I'm kind of emphasizing this point is I don't think we realize the amount of damage we do to people when we keep talking. The more you talk to a person in grief or a person who is struggling, and the more commands that you give them, the likelihood of doing something incredibly damaging is heightened. Okay, now you also have to think about this. If someone has asked you for help and you damage them, you burn them, okay, what you've also created is a really bad situation. because now this person who has been damaged is less likely to seek help from someone in the future. Because they tried that once and it backfired. And so now it's most likely we're going to push them deeper into their grief and make them avoid anyone trying to help them whatsoever. And so we have to be careful. And I'll just leave it there. We need to be very careful. So let's pick up and somebody read verses 8 through 17 for us, please. 8 through 17.
But as for me, I would seek God, and to God I would commit my cause. Who does great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number? He gives the rain on earth, he sends waters on the field. He sets on high those who are lowly, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. He frustrates the devices of the crafty so that their hands cannot carry out their plans. He catches the wise in their own craftiness, and the counsel of the cunning comes quickly upon them. They meet with darkness in the daytime and grope at noontime as in the night. But he saves the needy from the sword, from the mouth of the mighty, and from their hand. So the poor have hope, and injustice shuts her mouth. Behold, happy is the man whom God corrects. Therefore, do not despise the chastening of the Almighty.
Okay. So, he says, as for me, I would seek God, and to God I would commit my cause. Okay? I mean, this is just bad. And here's why. Has Job stopped seeking God at all? Do you see how insulting the insinuation is out of the gate? As for me, I would seek God. And if I'm Job, I'm going to be dripping in sarcasm. I'm going to be like, well, good grief. If I'd have known that's all I'm supposed to be doing, then I'd have been doing that. I've been doing that. You see, Eliphaz adopts a view of life that's not real. And a lot of Christians adopt a view of life that's not real, and they end up hurting people. That if you just do this, everything will go great in your life. No, it won't. Life is going to hurt you. And you allowing yourself to be hurt doesn't mean that you are unspiritual. And so, when he comes out with the advice, just listen, am I ever going to say to someone who is struggling with any type of thing, am I ever going to discourage them from reading their Bible and praying? No. But they've probably been doing that all along. We need to plunge a little bit deeper. Okay? We need to be thinking much more deeply about the complexity of the situation and be careful what we insinuate with our words. Because look, when he says, I would seek God, again, if I'm Job, I'm thinking, you think I'm not doing that? Then he says, God, speaking of God, who does great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number. Obviously, he gives rain on the earth and sends waters on the field. He sets on high those who are lowly, and those who mourn are lifted out of safety. And so the idea behind that is God takes care of them. He can lift them out of situations. That's an accurate statement. It just doesn't necessarily apply to Job and his situation. And so he frustrates the devices of the crafty so that their hands achieve no success. He catches the wise in their own craftiness, and the schemes of the wily are brought to a quick end. That is true. People who practice evil, we talked about, I think, last week, the words of Jesus, those who take or live by the sword perish by the sword. If you live a rough, gruff, violent life, that's probably how your life is going to end, right? And so, generally speaking, that's pretty true. And he says, basically, he just keeps creating these dark images of what happens when people are unrighteous. Verse 14, they meet darkness in the daytime and grope at noonday as in the night. So, they meet the darkness in the daytime. That is, they're lost, they can't see. And they grope, that is, they're feeling around. Okay, at noonday as at night. They're just completely lost. Proverbs, which is similar literature, talks about, I think it's Proverbs 4, 18 and 19, that the wicked do not know over what they stumble because they walk in darkness. You don't know what you're tripping over. You just keep tripping over it. So that's what he's saying. This is what happens to the wicked. And it may be an implication, of course, based upon what he said in the previous paragraphs, that Job is one of these wicked people. Then in verse 15, but he saves the needy from the sword, from the sword of their mouth, and from the people of the mighty. So the poor have hope, and injustice shuts her mouth. That is, God sets everything right. And that is true. And God will ultimately set everything right. But look, again, this is where a lack of nuance and being really just a little bit naive about how the world works. Will God ultimately set everything that has ever been done wrong right? Yes. Will He do that in my lifetime? Not unless He comes back. We have to understand that there has never been a promise from God that if you follow Him, then your path is going to be rosy and people are going to mistreat you, but that's okay. They'll realize their fault, or they'll get what's coming to them. Like that's not biblical. Tell it to martyred Christians. So, again, speaking in generalities, he's not being really helpful, okay? Then he says in verse 17, behold, blessed is the one whom God reproves. Therefore, do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. Okay, so this is another case. Is this true? Does this come from Proverbs? Yes, it's Proverbs 3, 11, and 12. Is it mentioned in Hebrews? Yes, Hebrews 12, 5 through 11. Is this statement true that we should not despise God's discipline? God disciplines us, and we should seek to learn from that discipline instead of getting mad at God. Is that true? Yes. Does it apply to Job's situation? No. No. And again, that's where we return back to this theme. Handle biblical truth correctly and make sure it's being applied correctly to the correct situation. Otherwise, it's of no help. God does discipline, but at the very beginning of this book, this is happening to Job because he was bad, or it's happening because he was good? It's happening because he was good. Okay? So the discipline discussion, that's not what's on the table. And so you take something and you misapply it. But you also, and this is what happens, and we'll see this consistent thread throughout all of the friends. This is what happens when people don't listen. The greatest problem with listening is that most of the time we do not listen to hear. We listen to respond. I mean, marital disagreements, work disagreements, all different types of things. It's because we're listening to respond rather than to listen to try and understand what you're saying, to understand how you communicate and what you're really saying. Because some of the things they're saying about Job, they're just not true. They're not true about what he said. They misrepresent what he said. They're not true about his situation. They don't fully understand the situation. They don't stop to fully understand the situation. And that's where you go back to the other old axiom, which is seek first to understand, then to be understood. You seek first to understand. Well, I think that person is ridiculous. Okay? I'm with you. But I need to make sure I'm understanding what's going on. And so again, you have a statement that is true, but it just doesn't apply in the context of what's going on. So in verse 18 he says, "For he wounds, but he binds up. He shatters, but his hands heal." That's true. Hosea 6:1, Deuteronomy 32:19, tons of other texts. Again, we're dealing with discipline. It says, "He will deliver you from 6 troubles, and 7 no evil shall touch you." And then he gives a number of these things listed. So you've got famine in verse 20, and war in verse 20, the lash of the tongue in 21, destruction in 21, the beasts of the earth in 22, and the stones of the field in 23. So a lot of the negative things that can happen, he will keep them safe, is what Eliphaz is saying. So in famine, he redeems you from death. That is, he does not let you starve to death. In war, the power of the sword, he protects you. You shall be hidden from the lash of the tongue. No one will say anything bad about you. Which, by the way, that right there, you ought to go, well, whew. You know, the human part of you that wants to respond to that wants to say, well, I'm fixing to say something bad about you, so apparently he's not protecting you from the lash of the tongue. You shall not fear destruction when it comes. Pretty sure Noah was probably afraid. Destruction came. He was safe. But I bet you he's afraid. At destruction and famine you shall laugh, and you shall not fear the beasts of the earth. This was a very real problem in Israel, where you had wild animals roaming. As a matter of fact, when they are conquered in the time of the kings, some of the poorest of the people are left in the land so that the animals don't basically take over. And so the land is somewhat cultivated. And then you shall, for you shall be in league, verse 23, with the stones of the field, and your beasts, and the beasts of the field shall be at peace with you. So this idea of stones in the field, there are a couple occasions in the Old Testament, one in particular in 2 Kings 3, and then some other laws that existed about, so what would happen is when you conquered a people, a lot of times in the destruction of a city, you would just take the stones and you would throw them all out in a field. Well, in an agricultural society, you take the stones and you throw them out in a field. What have you done? Messed your field up. You're going to have to expend a ton of energy to get those things moved. A ton. Because we're not talking about throwing rocks like we're skipping them at a campsite. We're talking about stuff that was used to build walls and structures. And so they would throw them out in the field, and they would dam up their water sources and all different types of things. And basically not just make life difficult for them, but set them back significantly. Would have to spend an entire season where they could have been doing something else. We could have been planting and harvesting and all of those types of things. Now they're having to rehash and re-prepare the field. So he says, you shall know that your tent is at peace, and you shall inspect your fold and miss nothing. That is, no animals are missing from your livestock. You shall know that your offspring shall be many, and your descendants as the grass of the earth. Again, these are common Middle Eastern concepts of prosperity. And it says, "And you shall go to your grave in a ripe old age, like a sheaf gathered up in its season. Behold, this we have searched out. It is true. Hear and know it for good." And so, just the same old, same old. If you're righteous, things will go well for you. If you're wicked, things will go bad for you. If only it were that simple. But life rarely is. And that's the thing, I'll say this and then leave it alone, but that's the thing too in Christianity. Sometimes we can hurt our credibility with people because we present overly simplistic solutions to really, really complex, hurtful things in the world. And people can sniff that out. They can sniff that out. Like what you're saying doesn't correspond to reality. And the reason why that's such a, it's a negative in a lot of ways. First of all, it turns people away. But second of all, because the Bible actually doesn't present that view. The Bible actually presents the most realistic view of life, and it walks right into the difficulties of life, and it addresses them head on. And when we try and sugarcoat it and say, no, everything's going to be great and rosy, we're actually misrepresenting what God has said. And so we end up failing to represent God correctly. We end up failing the individual because we have the answer that could help them find fulfillment and comfort, and then we end up pushing them away further. And so it's just not a good situation all around. All right, so that's the end of Eliphaz's speech. Any questions or anything, anybody, or comments or anything else anybody wants to add? We'll start looking at Job's reply here in just a minute. All right. Somebody read for us. Well, let me get this going. So Job's response will cover chapters 6 and 7. So in chapter 6, he kind of addresses his friends, specifically, obviously, Eliphaz. He's the one that gave the speech. And then in chapter 7, he kind of turns his attention to God and says, all manner of things, hoping that he can die, which is very similar to chapter 3. All right, somebody read for us, if you don't care, Job 6, 1 through 7. Job 6, 1 through 7. Okay. So, Job is going to come out of the gate very strong, and I believe very justified. Now, notice this. It says, Job answered, "Oh, that my vexation were weighed." Now, to understand that, in chapter 5, Eliphaz uses the same term in trying to describe him. He says, "Surely vexation kills the fool," implying that Job is the fool. Okay? That's why he's so distressed. He's the fool. Okay? So what does Job do? He starts his speech right there. He says, "Oh, that my vexation were weighed." In essence, let's translate this. You want to talk about vexation? Let's talk about it, buddy. You want to talk about it? Let's talk about it. If you weighed my vexation and you put it in scales, you put it in those old measuring scales that they used, if it were laid in the balances, it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. The suffering that I'm enduring is heavier than the sand of the sea. And you know sand gets heavy. Heavy. I mean, you go to the beach, you put the tent down, you use the sand, you drive it into the sand, you pile it into things to keep the tent down. It can withstand some pretty significant winds. Sand is heavy. You pick them up, you try and move it, you try and move the bags. It's heavy. And what he's saying is, vexation, it's pretty easy for you to talk about vexation. I feel the weight of all of it. You don't feel any of it. I'm feeling it. And he says, therefore, my words have been rash. Now, I don't think Job is actually saying he thinks his words have been rash. I think he's using Eliphaz's terminology. You think I'm out of line? Okay, let's see if we can translate this. I'm sitting here in the hospital bed, the one hurting, and you're over here telling me how I'm supposed to be feeling about it? Mm-mm. Job said, nuh-uh. You're not going to sit here and lecture me on this. He says, for the arrows of the Almighty are in me, and my spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Now you remember, Job does think that God is doing this to him. He does not understand why. And he does not, as he will continue to argue, he does not believe that he's done anything to deserve it. He doesn't say he never did anything wrong. He said, I never did anything to deserve this. And he's right. But see, he's seeing it as God is shooting him with arrows, and my spirit is drinking in their poison. And so, obviously, poison arrows have long been something used in warfare. And so that arrow goes into his body, and the inside begins to take that poison and circulate it throughout his body and do all different types of things. And the terrors of God are arrayed against me, talking about the idea behind terrors. He'll talk about it here in just a minute with night terrors and other things, but just constantly feeling afraid and overwhelmed and all different types of things. They just keep coming upon him like an army, wave after wave of terrible warriors. It's like they're coming upon me. And so he feels like, number one, the weight of all of this suffering is too heavy, and then he feels like God is the one doing it to him, which for Job is a special type of torture because of his love for God. Look, it's one thing. The bottom line is this, and it's a hard reality to accept. Who has the ability to hurt you the most? The one you love. The one you love has the ability to hurt you the most. I'm not saying you should be cynical. I'm saying it is reality. When you choose to love someone, you open yourself up to the wild possibility of unimaginable hurt. That's how it works. And so Job feels the weight because Job loves God more than anything. And the fact that he feels like the pain is being inflicted by God for a reason he can't understand. I mean, you're just adding all the sand of the seashore a couple times over on him. And so he's overwhelmed in it. And he says this, so does the wild donkey bray when he has grass? When he's fed? No. Or the wild ox over his fodder? They tend to be okay. Can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt? I mean, it's not preferable, especially in that culture, salt bringing taste. Or is there any taste in the juice of the mallow? Which some translations will call it a slimy cream cheese. I don't know. The point that he's making is, no, it's not good. My appetite refuses to touch them. They are as food that is loathsome to me. Now, we have to remember we're dealing with poetry here. And so there's the possibility that Job, obviously here, does not have the idea of actually eating food in mind. I think what he has in mind is the advice of his friends. And in essence, he's not complaining for nothing. He's not a guy that's complaining for nothing. Okay? If an animal is content when they are fed, they don't get into all the noise making and different things. If I'm making noise, would tend to understand it as something's wrong. And so that's what he's arguing, is that something is significantly wrong. And I'm not just, in essence, I'm not just being a baby. I'm not just imagining it. I'm not just making it up. This is something that is legitimate. Okay. Then he says in verse 8, "Oh, that I might have my request, and God would fulfill my hope. That it would please God to crush me, and that he would loose his hand and cut me off." Oh, that I might have my request, that God would fulfill my hope. Now, when you and I think of hope, we think of it in positive expectation. Job kind of uses it in the sense of a paradox. We think of hope in the terms of continuing to live, like resurrection hope. He thinks of hope in his situation as, I just want to die. What I want is for God to just kill me and get this over with. That's what I want. And, some people recoil at that notion, and some people even rebuke that notion. No, you got to want to live. I'll give you my opinion and my perspective on it. I've sat with a lot of dying people. There are things worse than dying. And some people need to be told it's okay for them to die. Because they will fight and fight and fight to the end because they're worried about people that matter to them. And sometimes what they need to hear is it's okay. We'll be fine. And Job is here wishing for death. I want God to crush me. Let loose his hand and cut me off, just like an executioner's axe. Just let it fall. Just end it. Now again, I have never in my life been to a point to where I thought dying would be better than living. I know there are people who have. And that doesn't necessarily depend on age and experience. That can happen all across the board. But that's definitely what Job feels. Because he says in verse 10, "This would be my comfort. I would even exult in pain unsparing. For I have not denied the words of the Holy One," or the holy words, depending upon translation. Basically, he's saying, I haven't done anything wrong. It would ease my pain. I'm fine with it. What is my strength that I should wait? And what is my end that I should be patient? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? Have I any help in me when resource is driven from me? Look, what Job is saying is, I'm not bulletproof. And sometimes when people suffer, sometimes especially people when we have a high regard for them, and when they suffer and they talk about struggling with their suffering, I don't know, there's something about it that unnerves us. And we're like, well, you can't feel that way. You know, you can't do that. And I expected more out of him or her. They wouldn't respond that way. And Job said, look, I'm a human being. It doesn't matter how strong you are. It doesn't matter how spiritual you are. When you hurt, it hurts. And it hurts the same. And so, that's his desire. We will pick up in verse 14, hopefully next time, as he continues his response.